Right now, somewhere on TikTok, a video of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy is collecting views. The captions read, "Quiet Luxury Inspo," or "Old Money Aesthetic," or just the word "effortless," with no further explanation required. Fashion accounts, nostalgia accounts, Gen Z aesthetic accounts cycle through her photographs without mentioning that she was a director-level executive at Calvin Klein for 7 consecutive years. That she managed celebrity clients, including Annette Bening, Faye Dunaway, and Diane Sawyer. That she ran Calvin Klein's biannual fashion shows and controlled who sat in which seat in front of which camera. That she wrote millions of dollars worth of VIP orders in the most image-conscious industry in the world. She has become, again, a surface. Beautiful, useful, voiceless. The 1990s tabloids cast her as an icy, overwhelmed outsider swallowed by the Kennedy machine. TikTok renders her as an effortless icon, too sublime to require context. Both versions need the same thing: for her to have no professional history, no expertise, no reasons for her choices beyond aesthetic instinct. Both versions get her wrong in exactly the same direction. Carolyn Bessette spent 7 years learning, at an expert level, exactly how fame is manufactured and managed. She then made a deliberate, clear-eyed decision to marry into the most scrutinized family in the country. Not because she didn't understand the cost, but because she did. What happened to her afterward wasn't a tragedy of naivety. It was a failure by specific people and systems that had the capacity to protect her and didn't. Those are very different indictments. The second one is more honest, and it's harder to look at directly. Chestnut Hill to 7th Avenue, January 7, 1966. Carolyn Bessette is born in White Plains, New York. She grows up in Greenwich, Connecticut. She graduates Boston University in 1988 with a degree in education. Not fashion, not communications, not anything that positions her for the career she's about to build, and enters a workforce with no particular connections to the industry that will define the next decade of her life. In 1989, she takes a job at Calvin Klein's Chestnut Hill Mall location in Boston. Retail saleswoman. She is 23 years old, working a mall floor in Massachusetts, selling clothes to people who walked in off the corridor. No connections, no legacy placement, no shortcut. Most biographical accounts of Carolyn move through this fact quickly, impatient to get to the glamour. That impatience is revealing, because the mall floor in Chestnut Hill is the most important single data point in her biography. She started at the bottom of a competitive industry, earned her promotions through performance in the roles she already held, and spent 7 consecutive years building expertise from the ground up. That arc makes the naive outsider narrative structurally impossible to sustain. And it starts in 1989, years before she ever knew John Kennedy Jr.'s name was relevant to her own life. By the end of 1991, Calvin Klein's New York executives had seen enough of her work to act. Paul Wilmot, who ran the publicity department at Calvin Klein and would later become senior vice president at Condé Nast, before launching his own PR firm, arranged for Carolyn to be brought from the Boston location to the Manhattan headquarters. New role: VIP sales. She was now the person responsible for managing the celebrity clients who came into the Calvin Klein showroom for private appointments. Famous people who shopped at a discount, required careful handling, and represented both significant revenue potential and significant reputational risk if anything went wrong. The job description sounds glamorous. What it actually required is worth understanding in detail. The clients Carolyn was now managing weren't casually famous people who dropped into a boutique on a whim. Annette Bening, Faye Dunaway, Diane Sawyer. These were people who had spent their careers being managed, photographed, profiled, and analyzed. People with experienced radar for the difference between genuine attention and performed attention, between someone who understood their world and someone pretending to. An appointment with Faye Dunaway in 1992 wasn't simply selling a coat. It was managing someone who had been through studios and sets and press junkets and decades of industry machinery, who would notice immediately if she was being handled poorly, and who was perfectly capable of telling her network about it. Managing clients at that level required intuiting what they wanted before they asked, making them feel exceptional without sycophancy, handling any awkwardness with seamless diplomacy, and doing all of it with the kind of effortless competence that makes complicated professional labor look like natural charm. Carolyn reportedly wrote millions of dollars worth of orders for this clientele. That revenue is concrete evidence. The celebrity clients came back. Annette Bening came back. Faye Dunaway came back. You don't generate repeat business at that volume with celebrities who could shop anywhere without genuinely earning the trust of people who are very experienced at recognizing when it's being manufactured. Wilmot's assessment of her was unqualified. She couldn't have been more perfectly suited for the role, he said. She looked the part, she knew the clothes, she had wonderful people skills and diplomacy. He also described her as completely, 100% the best listener and totally empathetic. Wilmot was the director of a professional department at one of the highest-profile fashion brands in the country. He wasn't writing a posthumous tribute. He was describing the performance record of someone who had made his operation function. Totally empathetic, in a professional VIP context, isn't a personality compliment. It's a capability assessment. It describes someone who understood that the machinery of celebrity management runs on making powerful people feel genuinely seen, who could execute that work consistently, and who had the discipline to distinguish between what a client needed and what they said they needed. Those are distinct skills. She had them. She kept rising. Director of Publicity, then Director of Public Relations. The exact title varied slightly depending on which department tracked it, but the mandate was expanding in the same direction. Her final position before leaving Calvin Klein in March 1996 was Director of Show Production. That role put her in charge of Calvin Klein's fall and spring fashion shows, which isn't a title that means she handled the invitations. A major Calvin Klein show in the mid-1990s was a precisely engineered media production, model bookings and management, which involved negotiating dynamics with agencies and talent, venue selection and staging, which shaped what photographs were physically possible, lighting decisions, music selection, runway choreography, all of it oriented toward a single outcome: the production of a specific set of images that would define Calvin Klein's brand identity for the next 6 months of retail and press cycles. Front row seating was its own operational sub-discipline. The front row of a 1990s New York fashion show contained the editors whose reviews would run in Vogue and Women's Wear Daily, the celebrities whose photographed presence would place the brand in the cultural conversation, and the buyers whose orders would determine whether the collection commercially succeeded. Where you seated someone was a message. Who was next to whom was a message. Who was excluded, or quietly moved to a less favorable position, was a message that could appear as a gossip item within 48 hours. Carolyn was managing those decisions. The architecture of access and exclusion at Calvin Klein's most important public events was her professional responsibility. She left in March 1996 with a salary in the low 6 figures and a 7-year track record that ran from retail floor to fashion show director. A 2025 academic paper in Feminist Media Studies subsequently identified Carolyn as the fashion executive who was subject to curtailment, noting stark disparities between the professional legacies of women like her and male contemporaries who were allowed to continue developing their professional identities beyond their famous relationships. The academics noticed it from a distance. The evidence was always there. She wasn't an outsider to the mechanics of fame. She was a professional who had spent 7 years inside the engine room of how it worked. Spring 1992. Picture the Calvin Klein showroom on West 39th Street in Manhattan, spring of 1992. The space is deliberately minimal. Walls white, fixtures spare, the luxury communicated entirely through what's absent rather than what's present. The VIP appointment rooms are off the main floor, private, away from any foot traffic. Discretion is the product as much as the clothing. Bolts of fabric are organized by season and weight. The lighting is specific, warm enough to flatter, controlled enough to show how a cut falls on a body. A personal order appointment has been scheduled. The client is John F. Kennedy Jr. Carolyn was assigned to manage the appointment. Sunita Kumar Nair's fashion biography, CBK, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, A Life in Fashion, is specific on the point. She was assigned by Calvin Klein to shepherd John through a personal order appointment. The verb shepherd contains the full weight of who was managing whom that day. In the operational structure of Carolyn's professional life, this was a client appointment. He was a task on her schedule. Her job was to execute it well, understand what he actually wanted versus what he said he wanted, make the entire interaction feel effortless, and write the order. What a personal order appointment at Calvin Klein actually looked like in 1992. The client arrives and is met privately. No public floor, no other customers present. Samples and options have been pulled in advance based on whatever information existed about this client's preferences. The associate walks the client through options, adjusts fits, makes the professional judgment calls about what works and what doesn't, handles the conversation about price and delivery with enough ease that the client never feels like they're shopping rather than being dressed. The transaction is the least important thing that happens. The relationship is the product. Carolyn had been doing this, at the highest level, for 3 years by the time JFK Jr. walked into that room. By biographical accounts from people who knew her, she came away from the meeting underimpressed. That detail sits awkwardly in the romantic mythology around their relationship, which wants the first encounter to carry the weight of recognition, the Hollywood beat where both parties feel the pull of something inevitable. A woman who had spent 3 years managing Annette Bening and Faye Dunaway had already developed the professional composure that comes from repeated proximity to notable people. Famous people were her workday. She could assess JFK Jr. accurately, register whatever charm was operating in the room, and still place him cleanly in the professional category of client I managed well today, without losing her bearings. The mythology needs her starstruck. The evidence suggests she was just good at her job. They didn't begin dating until approximately 1994. 2 years elapsed between the showroom appointment and the relationship. During those 2 years, Carolyn continued rising at Calvin Klein, getting promoted, expanding her mandate, building her professional standing in New York entirely on the strength of her own performance in the roles she already held. She didn't treat his awareness of her existence as a reason to redirect her professional life around his orbit. She moved at her own pace. Her career wasn't organized around his proximity. When they finally started dating in 1994, she was 28 and had spent 5 years inside the machinery of celebrity and image management in the most competitive media market in the country. She understood what the Kennedy name generated in terms of press attention. She had been watching press dynamics from inside the fashion industry long enough to know how quickly a narrative attached itself to a woman in a famous relationship, how a photograph became a character assessment, how thoroughly a public construction could diverge from the private reality of whoever was inside it. She chose to enter that world with that knowledge intact. She chose him anyway. The distance between understanding a cost clearly and choosing to pay it's where the actual complexity of her story begins. September 21st, 1996. By early 1996, the engagement was known, and the press machinery had begun assembling around the expected event. A Kennedy wedding was guaranteed editorial content. Publications were speculating about venues, dates, and guest lists. Celebrity photographers were already making calls. The entire infrastructure of 1990s celebrity journalism was positioning itself around whatever happened next. Carolyn and John gave it nothing. On September 21, 1996, on Cumberland Island, Georgia, a remote barrier island off the Georgia coast, reachable only by ferry or small private aircraft, with no road connection to the mainland, famous primarily for its wild horses and undeveloped interior, they exchanged vows in a candlelit ceremony attended by approximately 40 guests. 40. The guest list itself was the primary security perimeter. The reasoning behind the number was stated plainly by insiders at the time. The longer the guest list, the greater the propensity for word getting out. Every additional guest represented a potential leak. 40 was a deliberate operational threshold, not a sentimental choice about intimacy. The logistics of Cumberland Island weren't incidental. The island's inaccessibility was a feature. A photographer trying to document the event without credentials would need to get onto the island by unauthorized means or position themselves offshore with telephoto equipment. Both significantly more difficult than surrounding a hotel or church on the mainland. The guest list and the location worked together toward the same outcome. A wedding the press couldn't document because the press couldn't physically get there. For 48 hours, the operation succeeded. The ceremony happened without a single unauthorized photograph being taken. What a public Kennedy wedding in 1996 would have produced is worth holding against that backdrop. A church in Massachusetts or New York, surrounded by hundreds of credentialed press and an equal number of uncredentialed photographers with telephoto lenses. Images filed by wire services within hours, running in every publication in the country by the following morning. The visual record of how Carolyn Bessette entered the Kennedy family would have been established in those photographs by people who didn't know her, in conditions she didn't control, with no ability to shape or correct any of it afterward. A facial expression becomes a character assessment. A candid moment becomes a permanent public document. The machinery that had already been assembling around her as the girlfriend would have operated at full power on the wedding day, producing a public construction of who she was from photographs she hadn't chosen and captions she hadn't written. She chose Cumberland Island instead. A woman with professional expertise in exactly these kinds of high-stakes media events. 7 years of thinking about who was in which room, who had access to what images a given event structure would make physically possible or impossible, applied that operational logic to a new kind of problem. The choice of a remote, inaccessible island was the same professional thinking she had applied to Calvin Klein's fashion shows, now directed at her own life. Her dress was designed by Narciso Rodriguez, her personal friend and former Calvin Klein colleague, who in September 1996 wasn't a recognizable name outside the industry. Relatively unknown. The fashion establishment was reportedly astounded by the choice. A Kennedy bride had access to any designer on Earth. Valentino would have considered the commission a career event. She chose a bias-cut silk slip dress from someone she trusted personally. Someone who had worked alongside her, who understood her professional world, who would protect the privacy of the fittings because he was a friend rather than a publicist managing a placement. The choice was so precisely miscalibrated against expectation that it altered the industry by accident. Rodriguez wasn't widely known when Carolyn wore his dress that September, and not widely unknown for long afterward. The Cut later described the moment as having inadvertently altered the fashion industry. The industry alteration may have been inadvertent. Choosing an understated bias-cut slip over anything spectacular enough to dominate the inevitable eventual photographs wasn't the product of aesthetic accident. A woman who had spent years watching which images from major fashion events anchored the coverage, which details photographers returned to, how the front row photograph traveled through the press cycle, that woman didn't make her most photographed fashion choice without thinking about what it would produce. Shortly after the ceremony, John addressed the media directly, asking them to respect Carolyn's privacy before she joined him outside for a few photographs. He was sincere. The plea produced essentially no lasting change in what followed. What the press actually did. Carolyn and John settled in a Tribeca loft in Manhattan, and their address became known within weeks. What followed across the next 3 years was a documented, escalating siege that the legal and security infrastructure around them was entirely unprepared to address. The economics of 1990s celebrity photography requires some explanation, because the market logic is what makes the behavior comprehensible without excusing it. A photograph of a celebrity in a staged or semi-cooperative context, leaving a premiere, at a charity event, photographed by someone they'd agreed to be photographed by, had a price. A photograph that captured genuine unguardedness was worth considerably more. A photograph that showed genuine distress was worth more still. The method for producing the second and third categories was to manufacture the conditions that generated those responses. Follow a subject through the street, shout at them, stake out their building, do whatever it took to provoke the involuntary moment that a tabloid would pay a premium for. In 1996, before Instagram had been imagined, and before celebrities had any mechanism for releasing their own images directly to an audience, the only way a photographer made money was to physically locate a subject and take the picture. The market for those photographs was real, well-funded, and disciplined by a simple incentive structure. Carolyn became, immediately after the wedding, one of the most valuable targets in New York. She was new. She was resistant. She refused to give the press anything it was expecting. No cultivated magazine relationships, no strategic appearances at events designed to produce favorable coverage, no performance of the celebrity wife role in any of its expected forms. That refusal didn't reduce her market value. It increased it. A compliant Kennedy wife who managed her press strategically and gave photographers what they needed was worth one price. The mystery wife who refused to cooperate, who was clearly uncomfortable, who wore sunglasses and kept her expression controlled, she was worth considerably more. The more she withheld, the stronger the financial incentive to get what she was withholding. The resulting dynamic was a trap she couldn't exit from either direction. Cooperation would have produced images and coverage that constructed the public narrative of who she was on terms she didn't control. Non-cooperation drove up the market incentive for more aggressive pursuit. There was no available position, no behavior she could adopt that would have caused the market to lose interest. The only thing that reduced the value of a photograph of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy was her death. Photographers knew the Tribeca building address and positioned themselves accordingly, as a matter of professional routine. Shouting at her in the street is documented by multiple accounts from people who were there. Shouted terrible things at her, in the language of those who knew her. Verbal assault deployed as professional technique to manufacture the reaction the cameras needed. Elizabeth Beller, in her 2024 biography, Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, documents the wardrobe response this produced. Sunglasses and covered-up clothing became, Beller writes, Carolyn's uniform whenever nearby paparazzi were a possibility. A uniform has a function. It exists to produce a specific, consistent outcome. The outcome here was to deny the cameras an expression they could use. Accounts from those close to her describe a woman who had become unable to move through the streets of New York without harassment. By 1997, she was progressively withdrawing from public life. A woman who had built her entire professional career on the ability to move through the world with ease warmth, and social fluency, was increasingly unable to leave her own building without running a gauntlet managed by people whose professional incentive was to make her react. On August 31st, 1997, Princess Diana was killed in a Paris tunnel while being pursued by photographers. The international response was momentarily enormous. European jurisdictions tightened their paparazzi regulations. In New York and at the federal level, the response was minimal. Diana died August 31st, 1997. Carolyn died July 16th, 1999. 22 months separated those two deaths. Whatever international outrage Diana's death had generated had not produced a legal framework in Manhattan that would have materially changed Carolyn's daily reality. The security apparatus around Carolyn during these 3 years was effectively non-existent. No bodyguards, no professional publicist to manage press requests and buffer her from direct contact. No security detail of any kind interposed between her and the cameras waiting outside her building each morning. The Secret Service protection JFK Jr. had received as a child was a function of his father's office. It didn't extend to him as an adult civilian, and what protection existed was whatever he chose to arrange for himself and his wife. By multiple accounts, he chose not to arrange any. John reportedly made a direct approach to the Manhattan DA's office at some point regarding the ongoing harassment Carolyn faced. He made a public plea for her privacy after the wedding. These aren't the actions of a man indifferent to her situation. They are the actions of someone trying to respond within the framework available to him. But a press plea isn't a bodyguard. An approach to the DA's office isn't real-time protection from the man with a camera positioned outside the front door at 7 in the morning. The formal response kept running behind the daily reality by months. His world and hers. John F. Kennedy Jr. was photographed in the White House before he could reliably walk. The images of him as a small child, crouching beneath his father's desk in the Oval Office, standing in the corridors of state power in a small coat, are among the most reproduced photographs of the 20th century. Before he had the vocabulary to explain what a camera was, he was already one of the most photographed children in the world. The press wasn't a threat he encountered as an adult and learned to manage. It was the weather, the constant background condition of his entire conscious life, present since infancy, as normalized as traffic. In 1988, People magazine named him their sexiest man alive. He reportedly hadn't known the feature was coming, and the unsolicited designation embarrassed him, but he handled the attention with the grace of someone who had spent 3 decades learning exactly how to move through cameras without giving them more than he intended. He knew how to make the brief public appearance that satisfied an appetite without feeding it, how to acknowledge a press presence without yielding to it, how to maintain the essential privacy of himself while the exterior remained accessible enough that the press didn't feel cheated. These skills don't come from media training programs. They come from a lifetime of practice that began before conscious memory. In September 1995, he launched George Magazine, a political publication with a pop culture frame designed to make electoral politics accessible to an audience that was losing interest in traditional political coverage. He wasn't simply a subject of media. He was a media proprietor. The magazine's central premise, that politics was a form of celebrity, that celebrity was a form of politics, that the two could be examined through the same cultural lens, reflected a sophisticated, operational understanding of how modern press attention actually worked. He negotiated advertising. He made editorial decisions. He cultivated the specific relationships with publications and journalists that a successful magazine requires. His relationship with the press was sophisticated, active, and professional level. He was its participant as much as its subject. And he had been since he was old enough to be either. None of that history produces insight into what it feels like to be targeted as a newcomer. It produces something different: competence at navigating a specific system from a specific position, a set of instincts calibrated by a lifetime of experience in his situation that didn't automatically translate to someone in hers. The press he had grown up in required him to be graceful and available. The press Carolyn was now facing required her to produce emotional content she hadn't chosen to give it, and punished her refusal to cooperate by intensifying the pursuit. The skills that had served him his entire life weren't the skills she needed. Carolyn's expertise was adjacent, but importantly, distinct. She understood, from her professional work, how celebrity coverage was constructed, how a brand event was shaped to produce specific images, how a PR operation managed the flow of information to publications, how celebrity clients were handled to minimize negative coverage risk. That knowledge was real and substantial. What she hadn't had, what nobody could have given her, was the experiential equivalent of John's lifetime of practice as an individual subject of press attention. She knew the machinery from the production side. She had never been what it was hunting. Those are two different bodies of knowledge, and the gap between them turns out to matter in ways that are measurable. Rosemarie Terenzio was JFK Jr.'s executive assistant and chief of staff at George Magazine, and Carolyn's close personal friend during the same years. Her memoir, Fairy Tale Interrupted, published in 2011, provides the most granular available first-person account of what daily life alongside both of them actually looked like. One detail from the memoir is telling. Terenzio notes that JFK Jr. loved that she treated him like a normal person, and not like JFK Jr. He was self-aware enough to notice and genuinely appreciate the moments when the distorting effect of his name wasn't operating on the people around him. That awareness implies he understood the distortion was real and constant. But there is a considerable distance between understanding abstractly that you are famous and understanding viscerally what it feels like to be a private person targeted by the same machinery as a new and unprotected arrival. He knew the first thing. The accounts suggest he found the second thing genuinely difficult to inhabit from the inside, despite his sophistication about the press in every other dimension. The Carolyn that Terenzio describes is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it's so comprehensively different from the tabloid construction. Shopping with Carolyn, Terenzio writes, was a whirlwind of handbags and stories. She was funny, warm, specific in her observations, someone whose company was evidently energizing rather than draining. Forbes, drawing on the collective account of those who knew her personally, described her as warm, kind, and nurturing to those who knew her, elusive and mysterious to the public, which, largely, didn't know her at all. The elusiveness wasn't a character flaw. It was a strategic response to conditions that made openness dangerous. The logic of the clothes. Carolyn's post-marriage aesthetic choices became a subject of enormous public interest almost immediately, and have never stopped being one. The minimalism, the neutral palette, the covered-up silhouettes, the sunglasses that seem to be a permanent fixture. Those choices have been read, for 25 years, as the expression of innate, effortless taste, as though she arrived with her personal style fully formed, emerging from some interior refinement that was simply who she was, unrelated to any professional context or lived circumstance. What that reading strips away is the 7 years of executive-level thinking about how clothing communicated in the context of media coverage that preceded every one of those choices. Carolyn had spent her professional life making daily operational decisions about which pieces photographed well from which angles, which aesthetic choices produced images that advanced a brand narrative, how the front row photograph with its specific sightlines would be cropped and captioned by the publications covering the show. She had done this work for Calvin Klein's fall and spring collections, 2 seasons a year, for 7 years. When she became the unwilling subject of the same press coverage she had spent her career shaping on behalf of others, She brought that same professional logic to her own presentation. The specific strategic value of the minimalism she adopted is worth being precise about. A photograph of Carolyn in sunglasses and a neutral covered-up coat that communicates nothing, no expression readable, no emotion legible, no detail that can be captioned as revealing, is worth less to the tabloid market than a photograph that shows something the market can use. The icy narrative the tabloids were building around her required images that supported it, an expression readable as cold, a body language describable as withdrawn, a visible reaction that confirmed the story already being written, a wardrobe that produced a blank surface, that gave the camera nothing to work with, actively impeded that narrative rather than feeding it. The minimalism wasn't aesthetic preference at the expense of personality. It was a communications choice that happened to look like aesthetic preference to anyone who didn't know the conditions that produced it. Beller calls it Carolyn's uniform whenever nearby paparazzi were a possibility. The word uniform is doing real work there. A uniform isn't a personal choice about how one prefers to dress on a given morning. A uniform is a system for producing a consistent, functional outcome. The outcome here was control over what the photographs could contain, or, more precisely, control over what they couldn't. It's important to be precise about what can and can't be claimed here. Carolyn left almost no public statements explaining her own reasoning. She gave nearly no interviews, and her inner life is largely inaccessible to the historical record. Whether she thought of her post-marriage wardrobe as deliberate PR strategy, in exactly those professional terms, we can't say with certainty. What we can say is that the behavior is entirely consistent with the logic of someone who understood image management at an expert level and was applying that understanding to her own survival conditions. The uniform whenever paparazzi were a possibility doesn't describe personal style. It describes operational dress code. The wedding dress fits the same logic and is worth revisiting on those terms. Choosing Narciso Rodriguez, her personal friend and former Calvin Klein colleague, not yet widely known outside the industry, over any of the major houses that would have competed enthusiastically for the placement, confounded every expectation about what the photographs from that wedding would document. A spectacular Valentino gown becomes the story. A bias-cut silk slip dress from a relatively unknown designer becomes a statement about refusing spectacle. The fashion establishment's astonishment confirmed it landed differently from what was expected, which is precisely what landing differently from what was expected is designed to produce. The cut later declared the dress had inadvertently altered the fashion industry, transforming Rodriguez's career and reshaping the bridal aesthetic for years afterward. The industry alteration may have been inadvertent. The choice wasn't the product of accident. Sunita Kumar Nair's CBK, Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, A Life in Fashion, described as the first sustained examination of her fashion legacy as its own dedicated subject, traces how her 1990s minimalism both preceded and configured the aesthetic that has dominated fashion discourse since roughly 2022. Carolyn Bessette Kennedy walked so the row could run, the cut wrote, which is accurate as fashion history and incomplete as biography. The row didn't invent understated luxury. It formalized and monetized a template that Carolyn had worked out under real pressure, in real time, for reasons that had nothing to do with trend setting and everything to do with surviving the conditions she was living in. The aesthetic traveled forward into the culture. The context that produced it was left behind. July 16, 1999. On July 16, 1999, JFK Jr. piloted a Piper Saratoga from New Jersey toward Martha's Vineyard. He and Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bessette were flying to attend the wedding of his cousin Rory Kennedy the following day. The aircraft disappeared over the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. Carolyn was 33. Lauren Bessette also died. JFK Jr. was 38. The crash was attributed to pilot disorientation in haze and low visibility conditions. He had recently upgraded from a smaller Cessna to the more demanding Piper Saratoga and was described as a good pilot, though not an experienced one. What belongs here, in a script about Carolyn's life, not her death, is what the crash did to the story of who she was. Death at 33, when you are widely recognized and have almost no public voice, tends to produce mythology rather than memory. It stops time. It removes the person from any further context. No subsequent interviews, no reinventions, no opportunity to correct the record in her own voice at 40 or 50 or 60. No chance to simply be alive in a world that had kept changing without her. Carolyn had given almost no interviews during her 3 years of marriage. The public record of who she was had been constructed almost entirely by people who didn't know her, from photographs she hadn't consented to, filtered through a tabloid apparatus she had spent 3 years refusing to feed. After July 16, 1999, she was permanently unable to contest any of it. The press that had stalked her through the streets of Tribeca covered her death with a warmth it had rarely extended to her while she was alive. She became, posthumously, the kind of figure the press found easier to romanticize than to actually know. The tabloid narrative, the difficult outsider, the troubled wife, the woman allegedly unable to adapt to the weight of the Kennedy world, had gone largely unanswered in the historical record because Carolyn had understood, correctly, that cooperating with the press constructing that narrative would only give it more material to shape. After her death, the narrative calcified into the version that persisted for 25 years. She had been right about what cooperation would have cost her. She was wrong only in her implicit assumption that silence would protect her from it. The press built its story around her silence instead of her speech. The record in 2024, Elizabeth Beller published Once Upon a Time, The Captivating Life of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy, which became a New York Times bestseller, a Los Angeles Times bestseller, and a USA Today bestseller. The book is explicit about the correction it's attempting. Beller writes directly that her biography was composed in an era that is much gentler on women like Carolyn Bessette Kennedy than the 1990s were, and names the mechanism. Carolyn's style was quickly warped into the narrative that Carolyn was a shallow princess. That construction had been built by the same tabloid press staking out her Tribeca building, and it hardened in the absence of any sustained counter-narrative from Carolyn herself. The New York Times ran its review under the headline, "Who was Carolyn Bessette Kennedy? Really?" A question that wouldn't have been given serious institutional space while she was alive. The press had already decided the answer and had no structural incentive to revisit it. The fact that it became a best-selling question 25 years after her death confirms that the historical record was always available to anyone who read it with care. It also confirms that it wasn't read with care at the time. It wasn't read at all, by anyone with a platform and a reason to try. What she deserves here is the particular and specific irony of Carolyn Bessette Kennedy's posthumous moment. The woman who spent 7 professional years managing other people's images, deciding which photographs got taken, which details reached which editors, which version of a brand or a celebrity appeared in which publication, is being image managed posthumously, without her participation, without acknowledgement of her expertise, by accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers who know her name without knowing the first thing about who she actually was. A 2025 academic paper in Feminist Media Studies placed her in an explicit comparative framework. Carolyn identified as the fashion executive who was subject to curtailment, set against stark disparities of experience with prominent male stars enjoying career longevity in the same era. The academic framing names a pattern that was operating around Carolyn even before the press had finished deciding who she was. Women in the 1990s, regardless of their professional achievements, were subject to a different set of rules about whose public identity was allowed to remain complex and whose got simplified into type. Carolyn Bessette had built a career that was, on its own terms, a legitimate professional achievement. 7 years at Calvin Klein, ending at director level, responsible for staging the brand's most important media events. That career was compressed into girlfriend of JFK Jr., and then wife of JFK Jr., and then, after her death, a set of photographs in a 1990s neutral palette. The compression wasn't incidental. It followed a pattern that the academic record has now started naming. The TikTok accounts running that same compression in 2024 and 2025 aren't operating with malice. They genuinely find her beautiful and compelling, and they're not wrong that her wardrobe has something to say about how luxury communicates. But they are running the same structural operation the tabloids ran, making her useful by making her silent, stripping the personhood out of the image to leave only the image. The tabloids made her into the icy outsider. TikTok makes her into the effortless icon. Both versions require her to have no interiority, no professional history, no deliberate reasoning behind her choices. The medium changed, the erasure didn't. Carolyn Bessette knew what she was walking into. She had 7 years of professional training in exactly how the mechanisms of fame operated, what they produced, and what happened to people who entered them without adequate protection. She made a deliberate choice to enter that world knowing the cost, and she brought every tool she had to the problem of surviving it. The secret wedding on a remote island, reachable only by boat. The dress from her personal friend, rather than the house that would have generated the most spectacular press placement. The wardrobe that gave the cameras a blank surface, rather than an expression they could caption. These weren't the instincts of someone overwhelmed. They were the decisions of someone who knew the game and was playing it as well as the conditions allowed. She was then failed by a legal system that had no functional tools for what she was experiencing on the streets of Tribeca, even after Diana's death had generated 22 months of international outcry and zero corresponding legal infrastructure in New York. By a security culture that treated her protection as optional, and her husband's lifelong comfort with the press as the final word on whether she needed any. By a husband who loved her and tried, who made the public plea, who reportedly sought legal intervention, but who had spent 38 years inside a version of the press machinery that she was experiencing as a new and targeted arrival, and who couldn't fully close the gap between those two experiences. Not out of indifference, out of the structural limits of what a lifetime of normalized press attention prepares a person to understand about someone for whom that same attention is a siege. She was 33 when she died. The woman who spent 7 years shaping other people's public narratives had almost no control over her own posthumous one. She deserves a legacy that looks more like her actual life than a mood board, a record that includes Paul Wilmot's unqualified professional assessment, and the millions of dollars in repeat orders from clients who came back because she was genuinely good at a genuinely difficult job, and the 40-person guest list on a remote Georgia island that the press couldn't reach, and the bias-cut slip dress from a friend rather than a spectacle from a sponsor. She deserves to be known as someone who looked at one of the most scrutinized lives in America, understood exactly what it would cost, and said yes anyway. That's not a cautionary tale. That's not a mood board. That's a person, and a more interesting one than either version we've been given. Subscribe for more stories like this.